So our last speaker of the day is Barbara Schneeman. Barbara is an Emerita professor of nutrition at UC Davis. In addition, her perspective as the director of the Office of Nutrition, Labeling, and Dietary Supplements at the FDA for several years, on USDA panels, and more recently on a National Academies committee to redesign the process for establishing the dietary guidelines for Americans, has contributed to her really well-rounded background. So Barbara, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, David, and thank you for including me in this workshop. It really has been a great day, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow as well. So, figure out the... These are my disclosures, and I think probably for this presentation the most important disclosure is that I was a member of the committee to examine the process for developing the dietary guidelines, and that will guide my comments for the presentation. So for the topic that I was assigned, I felt the best question to address is to look at how can sustainability be integrated into the dietary guidelines for Americans. Those of you who are not familiar with the dietary guidelines or the DGA, these are guidelines that form the basis for federal policy in nutrition. And I'll have a little bit more about that. So my approach to addressing that question then was to use the report, Redesigning the Process for Establishing the Dietary Guidelines, which was published in 2017. And I think the report was particularly useful for this task because the committee did do a very thorough job to examine the evolution of the dietary guidelines and the methodology that's been used. And then in the recommendations in the report, it identified 3 essential functions that are currently conducted by the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, working with the staff from the Departments of Health and Human Services and USDA. And that looking at those 3 functions, I think illustrates points of if sustainability were to be integrated into the dietary guideline, how do we do it through those 3 functions or those 3 points? So this table, and see if I can, so this table I took from the report, and it basically illustrates the redesign that the committee proposed. I'm not going to go through the redesign. It's not really needed for this. I think what's important is the committee recognized that for each phase of the dietary guidelines, you need the right expertise and the right investment of time and resources to really do each of these functions. And for those, again, if you're not familiar with the dietary guidelines, I'll keep referring to the DGA cycle, and the guidelines are expected to be released every 5 years. And so that constitutes a dietary guidelines cycle, is release and then beginning the process again. So in terms of the functions that we identified, they include strategic planning, analysis, and then synthesis and interpretation. And again, if you look at what the committee has been doing in conjunction with the 2 departments that issue the guidelines, it really, these functions are very important and give us the opportunity to think about how to integrate sustainability. I will just point out that the committee, in identifying these functions, really felt that they needed to be more evident in the process. And again, they needed to be staged in a way that supported the overall process. And in general, they encourage more strategic planning across cycles of the dietary guidelines. So there was really a longer-term look at development of guidelines. And with strategic planning, if there is more, then it creates the opportunity to think about how does a new topic, such as sustainability, get integrated with the dietary guidelines. So in the next slides, I'm going to take each of these three functions, strategic planning, analysis, synthesis, interpretation. I'm going to look at sort of how the committee saw those functions, and then where does it create an opportunity for integration. I mean, for me, it's kind of fun from the committee. I feel like I'm doing a case study for the proposed process. So beginning with strategic planning, and these are words from the report itself in terms of what the committee observed. It proposed different committees to handle each of those. So that's what I put in parentheses. There was a proposal for a planning and continuity group. And it really, the function of such a group would be planning support to assure alignment with long-term strategic objectives that might span multiple DGA cycles. Identifying and prioritizing topics that the Science Advisory Committee would evaluate in a subsequent dietary guidelines cycle, and then overseeing the monitoring and surveillance of new evidence. And again, it's not that this planning group gets involved with developing the evidence or evaluating the evidence, but really looking to see when is there evidence to say that a topic might be ready for prime time. So in this context then, for looking at how sustainability might be integrated into the strategic planning phase, it's clear that delineating the topics that need to be addressed and then how those topics relate to the purpose of the dietary guideline are probably the two key points to look at. And again, this slide was taken from the webinar on the release of the report, in which we looked at the purposes and audience for the dietary guidelines. And what the committee had found in its examination is there tends to be multiple statements about the purpose and audience for the dietary guidelines. So it really encouraged clarification and some continuity in how that purpose statement was worded. And we actually proposed a purpose statement, and we tried to align that wording with the wording that's in the legislation that sets up the dietary guidelines cycle, the National Nutrition Monitoring and Related Research Act. So we emphasize that it's to provide science-based nutritional and dietary information, guidelines for the general public, form the basis for any federal food, nutrition, and health program. So the goals then become to help improve health, reduce the risk of chronic disease, provide the federal government with a consistent approach for nutrition policy and messaging. Now, I would observe that sustainability is not an explicit part of that purpose statement. Obviously, there could be ways to make it an explicit part of the purpose statement, but I think that perhaps is the task at hand, rather than each of us kind of coming up with our own version of how it fits the purpose. How should the purpose address sustainability? So the other aspect then is to identify and prioritize topics for the Science Advisory Committee to evaluate during the subsequent dietary guidelines cycles. And this, again, is a figure that's taken from the report, where the committee looked at the kind of criteria that are involved with selecting topics for the dietary guideline process. And it divided it into three buckets of topic identification, topic selection, and topic prioritization. And it recognized that topic identification and topic selection are probably areas where there should be stakeholder input, not just internal government input, but there should be non-government stakeholder input as well. When it comes to topic prioritization, that probably does become more of a task of whoever the strategic planning group is, the people who are doing the planning and continuity. And our committee recognized that planning and continuity group could include both federal and non-federal stakeholders. Now, I know it's not easy to read all the text in here. I pulled out some of the text from these buckets. And I would just emphasize, if we look at this first part of topic identification, it does focus more on the relevance to diet, nutrition, and health. And when we get to the bottom part, looking at prioritization, it talks about public health urgency, the availability of evidence-based intervention. It suggests consideration of cost-effectiveness studies. And again, at this point, I would say sustainability is not an explicit part of that process, but certainly it could be a way that we think about how should sustainability be integrated into this process. I would note that I believe the USDA HHS did ask for comments on the topics for the dietary guidelines. So there does seem to be an interest in opening this process up to what topics need to be considered. I don't know if any topics came forward on sustainability. I didn't read through the, Eve, how many, 6,000 or some odd comments that came in. So then if we say, okay, so we need to delineate topics, we need to relate those topics to the purpose of the dietary guidelines. When I think about the challenges and opportunities then that are inherent here, I think the first challenge is really, what are the objectives for including sustainability? Is it to justify the recommendations? Adam, I think you said this morning, good for me, good for the planet, done. Or is it to consider the environmental impacts due to dietary shifts? I think we've had a lot of discussion along those lines. Is it to see if the recommendations are feasible given current economic and agricultural capacity? Again, I think we're getting discussion along those lines. And I would note that FAO, WHO published a report on preparation and use of food-based dietary guidelines, and they pointed to the importance of looking at issues such as economic and agricultural capacity in the development of food-based dietary guidelines. And I think it preceded your Easton statement. Then I think clarifying how sustainability relates to the purpose, that's another opportunity to really think through how do we integrate it into the dietary guideline process. And obviously, if it is to be a topic that's considered, then the relevant expertise needs to be in the strategic planning process, either through committee membership or subcommittees that are developed, but that expertise needs to be a part of the process. Okay, so for moving to the next phase, then the analysis step, these are the types of evidence that are currently used by the to develop the dietary guidelines. Original systematic reviews that are conducted with support from the Nutrition Evidence Library at USDA. They do also use existing systematic reviews, meta-analysis, and reports. They have to be relevant and they have to meet the criteria that are set by the process. Descriptive data analysis, such as intakes of food and nutrients, such as we get from NHANES, what we eat in America, that's a key part of the type of evidence that's looked at. And then increasingly, food pattern modeling analyses have been important to see what kind of dietary patterns, in fact, meet the recommendations that are in the dietary guidelines. So the committee proposed the use of technical expert panels, or TEPs, so that there would be that sort of independent expertise to provide content, methodological consultation on domains subject matter domains that were needed for the process. And as an example, they could be involved in conducting systematic reviews, helping to operationalize the research questions that are to be addressed, looking at eligibility criteria for the literature review, or clarifying the systematic review questions so they follow the PICO format and can be addressed through systematic reviews. Obviously, if there were such a specialized topic as certain aspects of sustainability, technical expert panels could assist with that technical review to bring that expertise into the analysis phase. And I think that supplemental expertise in the food pattern modeling and descriptive data analysis could be critically important if sustainability is now to be a factor in how we think about food pattern modeling and the types of descriptive data that are going to support the dietary guidelines. So to integrate sustainability into that analysis phase, probably the most important question still is, what are the topics and research questions on sustainability that require that type of evaluation? And so defining those topics and research questions that can be addressed through systematic reviews. It sounds like there are some systematic reviews, but they would need to be looked at in the context of the dietary guidelines. Identify descriptive data analysis that is most relevant. As I pointed out, NHANES is now one of the primary descriptive data analysis tools used in the dietary guidelines. What's relevant from the sustainability point of view? And then how do we think about food pattern modeling in relation to sustainability? If food pattern modeling has been used to look at meeting the recommendations, do we now need to build sustainability into the way those models are developed? And obviously we would need domain experts in these technical expert panels. So then the third phase is the synthesis and interpretation, and this is the work that those of you familiar with the dietary guidelines probably most closely align with the current Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee. We renamed it the Scientific Advisory Committee because we wanted to emphasize the science. So they do that synthesis, interpretation, and integration of the data and the evidence, looking across studies, looking across different types of data sets, to develop recommendations, to develop their conclusions on the total body of evidence that then will go to the secretaries. But in addition, they identify new analysis that might be needed, topics where more evidence is needed. They can suggest topics for future DGA cycle. They develop research recommendations. And of course, the main task is that scientific report to the secretaries with their conclusions. So if we're going to integrate sustainability into that synthesis and interpretation phase, obviously that scientific advisory committee should include experts who can provide the relevant knowledge and context to review the evidence on the topics that have been identified. There's an earlier report from this committee on selection of Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee members, and those criteria would have to apply to selection of such experts for the Science Advisory Committee. I think the main challenge here to think about is in the process to nominate and select Science Advisory Committees, the process needs to specifically identify the areas of sustainability that would be considered. So if we know the topics, then the nomination process can call out the types of expertise that would be needed for the Science Advisory Committee. So just in this table, I've tried to integrate across the three areas to sort of summarize. So for strategic planning, clarify the role of sustainability in the purpose of the dietary guidelines, make that explicit. Identify the topics and objectives related to sustainability that are relevant to the dietary guidelines, and then develop a long-term plan for addressing sustainability across the dietary guidelines cycles. It's not going to happen just in one cycle. For the analysis phase, I involve experts in sustainability to define the research questions and parameters for systematic reviews, use technical experts to identify the relevant data sources, and rethink approaches to dietary patterns, the food pattern modeling, to incorporate sustainability. And then the synthesis and interpretation phase, identify topics related to sustainability so that the relevant expertise during the Science Advisory Committee nomination process can be identified. And then in that report to the secretaries, develop conclusions on the topics identified, but also identify the research needs, the evidence needs, and future topics on sustainability that should be addressed. Now, I haven't talked at all about the final step, the federal review and update that leads to the publication of the Dietary Guidelines Policy Report. But I do think that if we're transparent in the early phases of identifying the topics, the analysis, and then the synthesis, what we're looking at, then I think the final stage kind of takes care of itself. It's much more evident in the overall process. And so my take-home message is about how can sustainability, about my question, I think the key thing is to clarify that relationship between sustainability and purpose, and then also to re-examine the resources for the three functions I've talked about: strategic planning, analysis, synthesis, and interpretation. That the resources that are currently going into the dietary guidelines process, is it sufficient to now add sustainability, and how might resources have to be shifted so that sustainability can be addressed in the process? And just as a final report or final comment from the report that I've been using as the basis of my comments, there was also a recommendation to consider the emerging importance of systems approaches. In our recommendation 7, we encourage the secretaries of USDA and HHS commission research and evaluate strategies to develop and implement systems approaches into the dietary guidelines for Americans. The committee recognized this is not the kind of thing that happens overnight, but it does take some investment to try and understand how can a systems approach, integrating systems mapping, how can that help enhance the system? I think it also creates a way that we can think, does sustainability, is it part of the dietary guidelines, or is it something that needs to integrate with the dietary guidelines in a systems approach way? So I want to be sure and include that recommendation as well. And I think the systems approach is also consistent with the recent report on science breakthroughs to advance food and agriculture research. So it's coming from several places. Thank you.